By the time the British Pacific Fleet appeared off the long arc of the Ryukyu Islands in early 1945, the war had already developed a hierarchy of relevance. Some forces were assumed to matter. Others were tolerated. The Royal Navy, arriving late to a theater defined by scale rather than tradition, was quietly placed in the second category. In Tokyo, the assessments were blunt. Britain was exhausted. Its carriers were smaller. Its aircraft were fewer. Its pilots had spent the war in confined seas, not in the open, relentless distances of the Pacific. Even among Allied planners, there was an unspoken expectation that the British contribution would be symbolic, a gesture of unity rather than a decisive instrument. The Pacific War, by this stage, belonged to American industry and American mass. Everything else was supplementary. The Japanese naval staff did not dismiss the British Pacific Fleet out of arrogance alone. They dismissed it because their own experience suggested it was logical to do so. Carrier warfare in the Pacific had become an exercise in volume. How many aircraft could be launched, how quickly they could be recovered, how fast losses could be replaced. The Americans had solved this problem through industrial saturation. Britain had not. Japanese planners, studying silhouettes and sortie projections, saw armored flight decks that reduced aircraft capacity and maintenance crews that worked beneath steel rather than open planking. They interpreted this as conservatism. A fleet designed to survive, not to dominate. Survival, they believed, would not decide the war. What they did not account for was what survival enabled. When the British Pacific Fleet integrated into American task force operations, it did so without fanfare. There were no speeches, no declarations of parity. British carriers were slotted into rotation schedules, assigned sectors, and given suppression tasks that American commanders considered necessary but punishing. The Sakishima Islands, a chain of airfields feeding aircraft into the Okinawa battlespace, became their responsibility. It was not glamorous work. It was repetitive, dangerous, and attritional. The objective was not victory in the conventional sense, but denial. Preventing Japanese aircraft from reaching Okinawa. Preventing them from ever taking off at all. Each sortie required the same sequence. Launch under threat. Strike under fire. Recover under uncertainty. Then repeat. The difference lay not in the mission profile, but in what happened when the mission went wrong. British carriers were hit. Repeatedly. Kamikaze aircraft found them just as they found American decks. But where American flight decks burned outward, consuming aircraft, fuel lines, exposed structures, British decks absorbed impact inward. Steel warped. Elevators jammed. Fires were contained below armored plating. Damage reports read differently. Not cleaner. Not easy. But survivable. Flight operations paused. Then resumed. Aircraft were moved around craters still warm from impact. Sorties continued from decks that Japanese pilots had already marked as neutralized. This was not lost on the men flying those attacks. Japanese after-action reports began to note anomalies. Targets struck without apparent effect. Carriers that did not withdraw. Task groups that remained operational after damage thresholds that should have forced disengagement. The reports did not name Britain at first. They did not need to. The distinction became obvious through pattern. Certain carriers simply did not behave as expected. By April 1945, the campaign had tightened. Okinawa was no longer a distant objective. It was a fulcrum. Everything that followed, invasion, blockade, bombing, depended on holding it. The Japanese air strategy collapsed into a singular purpose. Aircraft were no longer assets to preserve. They were weapons to be expended. Pilots were briefed accordingly. Survival was not discussed. Accuracy was. It was into this environment that the British Pacific Fleet flew its heaviest schedule. Day after day, British aircraft lifted from armored decks and flew into airspace saturated with interception risk. They struck runways, hangars, fuel dumps, and dispersed aircraft. They returned with losses that were accepted but not dramatized. Maintenance crews worked beneath dented steel, restoring just enough functionality to launch again. By the time the sortie count passed 250, the number itself no longer carried meaning. What mattered was continuity, the fact that the sorties did not stop. For the first time, Japanese commanders began adjusting expectations rather than tactics. British carriers were no longer treated as peripheral. They were factored into calculations of denial and endurance. Not because they overwhelmed defenses, but because they refused to collapse under pressure. The mockery faded without announcement. There was no reversal memo, only a shift in tone. British task groups were now described in the same language as American ones. Persistent, resilient, difficult to suppress. From the air, the distinction between fleets ceased to exist. British and American aircraft operated in the same lanes, struck the same targets, and returned to decks pointed toward the same narrowing horizon. The Pacific War had reduced everything to function. Who could stay? Who could keep flying? Who could absorb damage and continue? Japan had assumed Britain could not. By late spring, that assumption was no longer defensible. What distinguished the British Pacific Fleet was not the scale of its presence, but the manner in which it absorbed pressure without altering its posture. American carriers operated on the assumption of replacement. Damage was tolerated because losses could be rotated out and replenished. British carriers operated on the assumption of continuity. They did not expect relief. They did not plan for withdrawal. Their doctrine had been shaped by years of fighting within range of land-based air power, under constant threat, without the luxury of depth. The Pacific did not require them to learn endurance. It required them to apply for it. This difference manifested not in dispatches, but in tempo. British flight operations resumed faster than Japanese observers believed possible. Where a kamikaze strike was expected to silence a deck for hours, British carriers returned aircraft within minutes. Fires were smothered beneath armor. Debris was cleared by hand. Aircraft were pushed around impact craters that would have rendered wooden decks inoperable. There was no improvisation celebrated later as ingenuity. It was a procedure, the result of anticipating damage rather than fearing it. Japanese pilots noticed before the Japanese command did. Accounts from downed airmen, recovered in fragments after the war, describe confusion rather than triumph. Hits that should have crippled carriers instead produced only temporary disruption. Pilots who believed they had destroyed their target watched it continue flight operations from the same heading, emitting the same signals, launching the same aircraft. In some cases, follow-up strikes were ordered against ships already believed sunk. The logic of attrition began to fail when destruction no longer correlated with effect. The British contribution was never intended to eclipse American dominance. It functioned instead as reinforcement of inevitability. Every British sortie meant fewer Japanese aircraft reaching Okinawa. Every runway cratered in the Sakishima chain reduced pressure elsewhere. The war at this stage was not won through decisive engagements. It was managed through denial, preventing success rather than achieving spectacle. Within this framework, British aircraft flew missions that were deliberately uneventful. There were no record-breaking dogfights, no iconic photographs. The pilots did not operate at the edge of technological novelty. They flew aircraft already judged inferior by contemporary standards. Their effectiveness derived from repetition, from flying the same routes, striking the same airfields, returning to decks that bore visible evidence of previous attacks. Fatigue accumulated, but morale did not fracture. The expectation was not survival without loss, but survival with purpose. American commanders came to rely on this predictability. By mid-May 1945, British carriers were fully integrated into strike planning. Their presence allowed American decks to cycle maintenance without reducing pressure on Japanese air assets. It was an efficiency invisible to the public but decisive in effect. The combined fleet operated not as two national forces, but as a single system calibrated for endurance. British ships absorbed damage. American ships absorbed volume. Together, they compressed Japanese options until none remained. Tokyo's response reflected recognition rather than surprise. There was no sudden reassessment, no admission of miscalculation. Instead, British carriers began appearing more frequently in threat estimates. Their names entered operational logs, not as curiosities but as constants. The mockery that had once framed British participation dissolved into administrative language. The most telling shift was absence. British ships were no longer singled out. They were treated as unavoidable. By the time Allied fleets operated within range of the Japanese mainland, the distinction between national contributions had ceased to matter. What remained was persistence. Sorties continued. Losses mounted. The sky above Okinawa filled and emptied according to schedules no longer disrupted by expectation. The war moved forward not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through pressure applied evenly and without pause. From a distance, it would later appear that American power alone had carried the Pacific to its conclusion. The records tell a more precise story. One of the systems layered atop another. One fleet reinforcing the endurance of another. Japan did not lose because it was surprised. It lost because it could not exhaust what it faced. And the British Pacific Fleet, once dismissed as irrelevant, had become part of the mechanism that made exhaustion impossible. For the men aboard the British carriers, the war did not feel as if it were approaching a conclusion. Proximity to Japan did not bring clarity or momentum. It narrowed my perspective. Days were measured by deck cycles, by maintenance windows, by the sound of aircraft returning through weather that offered no margin. The Pacific, vast in abstraction, contracted into routines enforced by necessity. Launch, recover, repair, repeat. The outcome of the war remained distant, theoretical. What mattered was whether the next aircraft would return intact, whether the deck crew could keep pace with damage, whether fatigue would outstrip discipline. British pilots did not speak of operating in sight of Tokyo. That phrase belonged to maps and communiques. From the cockpit, there was only water, clouds, and the faint geometry of islands that appeared identical until something rose to meet them. Anti-aircraft fire did not announce itself as historic. It arrived as force, impersonal and accurate. The Japanese defenders, increasingly constrained, did not fight less fiercely. They fought with the understanding that delay was the only remaining tool. Every sortie intercepted, every aircraft damaged, bought time. The Allied fleets felt that resistance as friction rather than threat. A drag on tempo, an accumulation of small impediments that never became decisive but never vanished. British losses mounted without ceremony. The aircraft failed to return. Pilots were listed as missing, then presumed dead. Deck crews cleared landing spaces for aircraft that never arrived. There were no speeches, no pauses in operations. The absence was noted, recorded, and absorbed into the schedule. Grief was not suppressed so much as deferred. There was no space for it. The fleet moved forward because it could not do otherwise. The effectiveness of the British Pacific Fleet lay partly in this refusal to dramatize itself. There was no attempt to distinguish British suffering from American suffering. No appeal to recognition. The system did not reward distinction. It rewarded continuity. British carriers continued to fly after impacts that would have removed others from the fight. Their crews worked beneath decks scarred and blackened, restoring function with the expectation that damage would recur. Armor was not treated as protection, but as permission to stay where withdrawal would have been rational. Japanese reconnaissance continued to track the fleet with diminishing optimism. Reports identified British ships as difficult targets. Not because they were elusive, but because striking them produced unreliable results. A hit no longer guaranteed effect. Kamikaze tactics, effective against exposed surfaces, lost efficiency against armored decks. This forced adjustments that Japan could not afford to make. New attack profiles required training. Training required time. Time had already been spent. By June, Allied naval air operations reached a condition of saturation. British and American aircraft operated in overlapping waves, erasing distinctions of origin in the sky. Japanese defenses reacted to presence rather than identity. When aircraft appeared, they were engaged. When airfields were struck, they were rendered temporarily unusable, then struck again. Repair efforts became exercises in futility. The war was no longer contested through maneuver, but through persistence. The British Pacific Fleet did not alter the war's direction through decisive blows. It altered it through refusal. Refusal to be sidelined. Refusal to be broken. Refusal to behave as Japan expected a secondary force to behave. In doing so, it became part of a pressure system that offered no relief. Every Japanese response was met by continuity rather than adaptation. Every loss was met by replacement rather than reconsideration. From Tokyo's perspective, the approach of Allied fleets was no longer evaluated through possibility. Only timing remained. How long before denial collapsed? How long before the air could no longer be contested at all? The presence of British carriers did not change the answer. It shortened the interval. And for those aboard them, the knowledge came slowly, not as triumph but as erosion. The realization that the war was not ending through victory, but through the exhaustion of every alternative. As Allied air pressure increased, Japanese command structures began to fracture in ways that were not immediately visible from the air. Communications still functioned. Orders were still issued. Units still reported readiness. But the content of those reports changed. Assessments became cautious. Predictions narrowed. Language shifted from intent to endurance. The question was no longer how to defeat the approaching fleets, but how long organized resistance could be maintained without structural collapse. British intelligence officers monitoring intercepted traffic noted this shift without commentary. There was no assumption of imminent surrender. Japanese communications had endured reversals before. What mattered was the pattern. Messages no longer spoke of counteroffensive. They spoke of conservation. Fuel allocations were recalculated weekly, then daily. Aircraft were redistributed not to achieve superiority, but to delay loss. The British Pacific Fleet, by its mere persistence, contributed to this recalibration. It imposed an additional variable on an already constrained system. Operational planning aboard British carriers reflected none of this explicitly. The men responsible for sorties did not receive intelligence summaries framing their work as strategically decisive. They were briefed on targets, weather, and threat profiles. The abstraction of impact remained distant. A pilot launched because he was scheduled to launch. A deck crewman worked because the aircraft required servicing. Meaning was not part of the process. Fatigue accumulated unevenly. Some men adapted. Others slowed imperceptibly, compensating through habit rather than energy. Mistakes were rare, but when they occurred, they carried consequences. A misaligned arrestor cable. A moment's delay in clearing a deck. A signal misread in poor visibility. Each error was investigated, corrected, and absorbed without drama. There was no room for escalation. The system corrected itself or it failed. Japanese air defenses, meanwhile, continued to function with increasing rigidity. Anti-aircraft batteries fired according to doctrine even when targets exceeded optimal engagement envelopes. Fighter interceptions occurred even when fuel reserves dictated restraint. These were not acts of desperation. They were acts of adherence. The structure remained intact long after flexibility had ceased to be viable. British pilots noticed the change first in the air. Interceptions became predictable. Enemy aircraft followed established vectors with minimal deviation. There was no attempt to probe formations, no exploratory engagements. Attacks were direct, sometimes effective, often costly. The sky, once contested through maneuver, became a corridor of repetition. For Allied aircrews, this reduced uncertainty but increased exposure. Predictability favored planning, but it also concentrated danger. Losses continued, not in numbers that demanded reassessment, but enough to reinforce the absence of illusion. The aircraft did not fail heroically. They failed through mechanical stress, structural fatigue, or brief exposure to concentrated fire. Men were lost not because of extraordinary action, but because the environment no longer tolerated error. Below decks, medical officers treated injuries that reflected this new phase of war. Burns from deck accidents, fractures from hard landings, exhaustion misdiagnosed as illness and later reclassified. The accumulation of minor trauma formed a record more telling than casualty lists. This was not a battle reaching climax. It was a system grinding forward. The British Pacific Fleet's armored decks continued to absorb impacts that would have disabled other carriers. But armor did not prevent injury. Shock traveled through steel. Equipment shifted. Fires ignited briefly, then were extinguished. The damage was managed, not celebrated. Repairs were conducted while operations continued. There was no pause for reflection. The Japanese command assessed these developments with growing detachment. Internal memoranda acknowledged the reduced effectiveness of kamikaze tactics against armored decks. Recommendations for alternative attack methods were noted, deferred, and ultimately rendered irrelevant by resource constraints. Training pipelines could not adapt fast enough. Fuel shortages made experimentation theoretical. The war's parameters were no longer adjustable. For the British crews, none of this translated into a sense of arrival. The sight of Japan on the horizon did not alter tempo. It did not signal a conclusion. It marked proximity without resolution. The war had not narrowed to a final confrontation. It had thinned into inevitability. American carriers operating alongside the British reflected the same condition. Differences in design and doctrine mattered less than shared exposure. Aircraft launched from multiple decks, returned to multiple flags. Losses were not attributed nationally. They were counted operationally. The fleet functioned as a composite organism, sustained by redundancy rather than distinction. When British aircraft struck targets closer to the Japanese mainland, the reactions were muted. There was no escalation in defense proportional to significance. The system lacked elasticity. It responded as it had before with diminishing returns. Each strike removed capacity faster than it could be restored. The mockery that once greeted the British Pacific Fleet's arrival no longer appeared in Japanese records. Not because respect had replaced it, but because relevance had. The fleet was no longer an anomaly. It was part of the pressure that could not be relieved. And within that pressure, the men aboard British carriers continued to operate without expectation of recognition. Their role was not framed as redemption or validation. It was framed as a continuation. The work proceeded not because it promised victory, but because stopping was not an option. By this stage of the war, that distinction mattered. By the time Allied aircraft were operating within direct reach of the Japanese home islands, the concept of escalation had lost coherence. There was no longer a threshold to cross that would fundamentally change the nature of the war. Each additional sortie added pressure but did not transform the equation. The machinery on both sides had reached a state where output mattered more than intention, and survival depended on endurance rather than innovation. British operational records from this phase become noticeably sparse in descriptive language. Entries list sorties flown, aircraft returned, aircraft lost. Weather conditions, fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, damage assessed. The tone is administrative, not evasive. There is no attempt to dramatize proximity to Japan, no emphasis on historical significance. The documents read as if the men compiling them were already aware that meaning would be assigned later by people who were not present. The pilots were aware of the stakes only in abstract terms. Few had any sense of how the war might end or when. Rumors circulated about invasion plans, about atomic research, about negotiations, but none altered immediate responsibility. A pilot briefed for a strike against airfields on Kyushu did not fly differently because the target lay closer to Tokyo than any before it. He flew according to the same checklists, the same approach patterns, the same fuel margins that had governed operations for months. Fatigue now became cumulative rather than episodic. Sleep was shallow. Rest days were insufficient to reset attention. Men performed tasks correctly while noticing, privately, that concentration required more effort than before. This did not collapse. It was attrition at the level of cognition. Small lapses were corrected by structure. The system compensated for human limits without acknowledging them. Japanese resistance followed a similar pattern. Sorties were launched with crews who knew their odds were diminishing. Training hours were reduced. Aircraft were cannibalized to keep others flying. Maintenance crews worked with tools that no longer met specifications. The structure persisted because it had not yet been ordered to stop, not because it retained strategic coherence. British and American intelligence assessments began to converge in their conclusions. The Japanese air arm was not defeated in a decisive sense. It was being consumed. Each interception removed trained pilots faster than replacements could be produced. Each destroyed airframe represented industrial loss that could not be offset. The war was being decided not through maneuver, but through exhaustion. For the British Pacific Fleet, this realization brought no sense of closure. The fleet's mission was not framed as finishing the war. It was framed as continuing pressure until conditions changed. That distinction shaped morale in subtle ways. There was no anticipation of a final battle, no expectation of a climactic confrontation that would justify accumulated risk. There was only continuation until an external decision intervened. Medical staff recorded an increase in stress-related symptoms that resisted clear diagnosis. Tremors, digestive disorders, persistent headaches. These were treated conservatively. Rest, hydration, reassignment where possible. The goal was maintenance, not cure. There was no time for deeper intervention. In the air, engagements became increasingly one-sided but no less dangerous. Japanese pilots still closed distance aggressively. Anti-aircraft fire remained dense near key installations. Aircraft were lost not because the enemy had regained initiative, but because physics and probability still applied. The sky did not become safe simply because outcomes were predictable. British carrier decks continued to cycle aircraft with mechanical precision. Launch, recover, service, repeat. The repetition itself became the defining feature of this phase of the war. Days blurred into one another. Time was measured in sortie counts rather than dates. When news arrived, fragmentary at first, that a single weapon might alter the course of the war, it was received without reaction. The information lacked context. It did not translate into immediate operational change. Flights continued. Targets remained assigned. The war did not pause to acknowledge its impending conclusion. The British Pacific Fleet remained in position, prepared to sustain operations indefinitely if required. That preparedness, more than any individual sortie, defined its contribution. The fleet did not seek recognition. It did not need validation. It existed as part of a system designed to apply pressure until resistance ceased. And when the moment came, when orders finally shifted, when the machinery slowed, it did not arrive with triumph. It arrived with silence. A silence that felt provisional, as if the system were waiting to be certain it would not be required again. The men aboard the British carriers did not celebrate immediately. Many did not react at all. Habit persisted longer than necessity. Only gradually did the understanding settle that the pressure they had helped apply would no longer be needed. For some, that realization brought relief. For others, disorientation. The war had defined structure. Its absence created uncertainty. The British Pacific Fleet did not return home as a symbol. It returned as a record of sorties flown, losses absorbed, systems sustained. Its presence near Japan had not been dramatic at the time. It had been effective in accumulation. And that, more than spectacle, is how wars end. The formal end of operations did not dissolve the routines immediately. Even after the announcement of Japan's surrender reached the fleet, carrier decks remained organized as if launches might resume. Aircraft were secured, not dismantled. Fuel lines stayed connected. Ammunition was inventoried rather than discarded. The system had been trained to continue, not to stop, and stopping required instruction as deliberate as any order to attack. Logs from the British Pacific Fleet dated in the days following the surrender reflect this hesitation. Entries note, stand down pending confirmation, awaiting further directives. No sorties scheduled, readiness maintained. The language suggests restraint rather than release. There was no assumption that the war was finished simply because it had been declared so. For many aboard the ships, the concept of victory felt abstract. They had not witnessed surrender ceremonies. They had not marched into cities. Their experience of the war's end was administrative. Reduced alert states, canceled briefings, aircraft left tied down longer than usual. The shift was subtle enough that some men later struggled to identify the exact moment they understood the war was truly over. American crews nearby reacted in similar fashion. Shared operations had created a shared psychological posture. Relief existed, but it was cautious. There was an unspoken understanding that history had taught them how quickly certainty could unravel. Medical personnel noted a delayed response among some servicemen. Symptoms that had been suppressed during active operations began to surface only after the pressure lifted. Fatigue deepened rather than eased. Sleep became heavier but less restorative. The mind, no longer anchored to immediate tasks, wandered back through months of accumulated exposure. There was no vocabulary for this at the time. It was simply recorded as adjustment difficulties. For the British sailors and aviators, the return journey was longer than anticipated. Demobilization required coordination across oceans and bureaucracies that had been built for war, not peace. Ships lingered, orders changed, timelines slipped. The fleet that had once moved with urgency now waited. During this period, letters home changed in tone. Earlier correspondence had focused on reassurance, brief confirmations of survival, minimal detail. Now descriptions expanded. The sea, the heat, the monotony, the sense of existing between events rather than within them. Some men struggled to explain what they had done. Others avoided explanation altogether. There was no parade because of its proximity to Japan. No single date that commemorated the moment British aircraft flew closer to Tokyo than ever before. The achievement existed primarily in operational reports and joint command assessments. It mattered strategically. It mattered historically. But it did not translate easily into personal memory. The British Pacific Fleet's contribution was cumulative rather than climactic. It did not hinge on a single engagement or decisive strike. It applied pressure in coordination with American forces until resistance collapsed under its own weight. That kind of contribution resists narrative simplicity. It lacks a defining image. It is visible only when viewed in aggregate. Years later, historians would frame the fleet's role as essential. Contemporary assessments would emphasize sortie numbers, integration efficiency, logistical reach. These analyses were accurate but incomplete. They captured what the fleet did, not how it felt to sustain effort without a visible endpoint. For the individuals involved, meaning emerged unevenly. Some found pride in having been present at the edge of the war's conclusion. Others felt only the quiet relief of survival. Many carried forward a sense that the war had ended around them rather than with them. The ships eventually dispersed. Crews were reassigned, released, or redirected into new roles. Aircraft were retired or transferred. The machinery that had once operated continuously was broken down into components and absorbed back into peacetime structures. What remained were records, logbooks, flight manifests, maintenance reports. Together, they tell a story not of spectacle, but of persistence, of systems maintained under strain, of coordination sustained across national lines, of pressure applied without expectation of recognition. The British Pacific Fleet did not arrive at Japan seeking acknowledgement. It arrived because the war required it to be there. And when it left, it did so quietly, without ceremony, having fulfilled a role defined less by drama than by endurance. That is how its story ends, not with a final strike, but with a gradual release of tension, as the machinery of war slowed, then stopped, leaving behind only the record of having been held together long enough for the war to end.